Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. At the time of recording, it's the 16th of March 2021. 13 days since the disappearance of Sarah Everard and 4 days since the very sad discovery of her body. We now know that in October, a serving Met police officer will face trial for the kidnap and murder of Sarah. The response from the printed press, the online media, social media and public gatherings of remembrance have been both staggering and phenomenal in equal measures. Perhaps now more than ever, these events have opened up many conversations that should arguably have already taken place. To discuss these events and to consider where we go from here, I'm joined by Deanna, Roxana and Stephen. Thank you very much all for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. I'll go around and get you to say a little bit about who you are and what you do to start with. Deanna, can we start with you?
Hello, my name is Deanna Dadusc. I'm a lecturer in criminology at the University of Brighton, and I'm also an activist within the Feminists Against Border collective here in Brighton, and for Watch a Mad Alarm Phone. And my work is on the criminalization of protest and the criminalization of migrant solidarity.
Thank you. Thank you. Roxana?
Hi, I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton. I teach criminology. I'm also the deputy leader for the Cities, Injustice and Resistance Research and Enterprise Group. And my research is around urban violence, but I tend to focus in the case of Latin America.
Thank you. And Stephen?
Yeah, hi, thank you. So my name's Stephen Burrell. I'm doing a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship in the Department of Sociology at Durham University. I'm based in the Centre for Research into Violence and Abuse there. And my research is all about men and masculinities, and in particular, the positive role that men can play in the prevention of men's violence against women and girls. So obviously, the recent events have shown, I suppose, just how important that work is. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And I wasn't quite sure where to start because it's such a big area and there's probably so much to cover that we could actually talk about this for weeks. But I mean, to start with, what do you think the events of the last few weeks have kind of highlighted about the society we live in to start with?
So that's a very big question to answer. For me, this is a very important moment historically because it brings together feminist groups that maybe in the past have been separated. The importance of this moment, and that we shouldn't forget, is that Sarah Everard was killed by a policeman, and these events brought forward discussions not only about violence against women, but particularly about police violence. And I think that what divided feminist movements and feminist groups and conversations until now has been exactly this role of a police divide in a way. So in order to fight against violence against women, do we need more security? Do we need more police? Or is police part of a problem? And for me, what is happening these days is historically important because many groups who still believe that the police is there to protect us, who still believe that the police is part of a solution to the problem of violence against women, actually realized and started agreeing that the police is part of a problem and that we cannot reduce violence against women by creating more security in the sense of militarized security, by creating more criminalization or by creating more prisons, but we need to go into a different direction that has to do with community safety, with educations, and with other ways of addressing violence against women.
I agree 100% with Deanna's analysis. I think what's really interesting is, over the last few years, feminist movements have gained loads of momentum. There's been lots of interest in those debates. We saw a few years back, the huge impact of the work of Laura Bates, for example, with her work on everyday sexism. And I think that really resonated to a lot of women. The fact that a lot of the violence that women suffer is routine. It happens inside the home, outside the home. It happens in the workplace. So, and often this violence is invisible. So women have to be. Sometimes it's invisible. Sometimes women have to be constantly on guard. Having to be on guard, making calculations on their on the everyday interactions, which is what some feminists have called, the continuum of violence. So I think this is a really interesting moment, and it has come at a particular time in our context in the UK, when the Home Secretary is trying to pass this new bill on policing, which gives even more power to police, and the police already have plenty of powers, and so it kind of made a lot of people worry a lot about what's going on, what direction the democracy is taking. Because of the way the police behaved at the weekend in relation to the vigils. And so the images of, women being manhandled by police officers were very upsetting, especially when many activists were, at the vigils. And they, the women were saying, everything was fine until the police got there. So it raised a lot of issues around, those ongoing inequalities in our society and the state of our democracy right now.
So I suppose the other thing that I would add to that is that, not only have the last few weeks kind of highlighted how pervasive violence against women and girls continues to be, and as was said, that's something which feminists have been trying to bring to society's attention for decades, but it seems like more and more people are really starting to recognise and take on board that, this is men's violence. In the vast majority of cases, it's men who are responsible for this violence and abuse, and therefore we can only, hope to be able to do something about this if we do recognize that, and if we take steps to address that, and so that means us men basically looking at ourselves, looking at how society defines what it means to be a man, and how boys are raised to kind of learn these ideas about masculinity, which are really at the roots of this problem and so many other problems as well, and men instigating change in ourselves, amongst one another, a structural level, as was mentioned, like government and other decision makers really pushing forward like serious kind of prevention work with a particular focus on changing those gender norms and gender inequalities, which are at the heart of different forms of men's violence against women. So I hopefully we have seen more discussion about that in the last few weeks, and hopefully those discussions will continue and more men will recognize how they can play a part in tackling this.
Yeah, and Stephen, I just wanted to pick up on that, because that's one of the key parts that, if you look at a lot of Twitter discussions at the moment about what role men can play, is this a time to sit and listen? Is this a time to be an ally? Is this a time to be an activist? And I think, having talked to a lot of my students who are around 16 to 18, a lot of the boys are sort of in a position where they are asking that question, what should they do at the moment?
Yeah. Well, I think all of those things, really. I mean, it needs all of those things to create change. But yeah, I think fundamentally the most important thing men can do, first of all, is to listen, right? Is to listen to what women and girls are telling us and what they've been telling us for decades, but we haven't been listening, and to reflect on that and what it means for us and our lives and our behaviour, and to take that on board. And then I suppose the next step then is to look at ourselves and how we can change our own kind of ways of being in the world, and then look to other men and boys and what change can we bring about there, whether that's our friends, our family members, our colleagues, our fellow students or peers, all of the different spaces in which we live our lives. We can be a positive force for change there, particularly with other men and boys. But yeah, I think we need to be sensitive about it as well, because obviously women have been leading this work for decades, and so we need to make sure we're not kind of taking it over, or we're not dominating the spaces, or we're not claiming to speak on behalf of women. But I suppose the key for me, is instigating conversations with other men and boys, and I suppose elevating what women are telling us, and bringing those messages into conversations with other men and boys. And I suppose, the next level ideally is to then become an activist, in our everyday lives and in a political sense as well, to address these issues.
I think for me, what is actually more important right now, as Stephen was saying, is also to learn from previous experiences, to listen to what has been said for so many years already. And I think that if we have to listen to what has been said for so many years, we have to listen particularly to what has been said by Black women, by migrant women, and within the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that what is happening today as in these days and this week, wouldn't have happened without the pre-mobilization of the Black Lives Matter movement starting from last summer, but started very important conversations around the role of the police, the role of police violence and police repression against Black women and Black men. So for me, what is important is also to not be shocked about what is happening today, because this shock or this surprise is a form of, in a way, it shows the white privilege of people who have never experienced this violence and who always saw the police as a protecting force. Instead, we have to start listening and learning from the critique that has been brought forward from the Black Lives Matter movement and from the experience of Black feminists in the United States and elsewhere, that show us that this police violence is structural, is not exceptional, and the only exceptionality at this moment in history is that it's being applied against white people and white women. So we shouldn't be surprised. We should only learn from what happened and what's been said earlier.
And just to go back to, what is being said here already, and to what Deanna was saying, I do really agree that, we need to draw lessons from feminist experiences. So I think, what can men do right now? I think there is still a lot of misunderstanding around what feminism is. There are many stereotypes still around feminists too. So I think one starting point could be for men to begin to live a feminist life. And I'm drawing here on the work of Sarah Ahmed. So, one first step could be go and read and study some feminist work. Really kind of try to understand, go and read bell hooks, Angela Davis, see what it is that they're telling us. What are the lessons, what are these histories of many different feminisms, and what can we learn from them? Let's debunk some of those stereotypes and then try to behave in feminist ways in your everyday life. And that includes, listening to other voices. That includes not dominating conversations. That includes lots of different actions in your everyday that can try to tackle, issues of hierarchical domination and inequalities in our society.
I think it's very important to listen, and I think also how we speak and how we represent these forms of violence is crucial. And I think we also have to be careful in how we frame the discussion around what's happening in these days, because there are, for me, two elements that need attention. And one key element is the focus on the streets. So it is crucial and very important that we reclaim the streets. But at the same time, we have to be careful in not focusing the discussion on violence against women to the streets, because we all know that actually most violence against women happen at home. As Roxana was saying earlier, it happens in the workplace, it happens in prison, it happens in asylum centers, it happens in all those places where women are supposed to be safe, but also in all those places where it is invisible. So I guess what is shocking in a way about what happened to Sarah Everard is not only that the perpetrator was a policeman, but also that it happened on the street by a complete stranger. And this is actually a minority of the forms of violence against women. So we have to be careful that we don't terrorize girls and women saying you always have to be afraid when you're on the street, or you have to be afraid of strangers, or you have to be afraid of people that don't look like you, or that, that are portrayed as a threat, because actually what you have to be careful of is abusive relationships, is abusive partners, is abusive bosses at work. So this is an important point that for me we need to bring forward. Let's focus on the streets and on reclaiming the streets and reclaiming the nights, but let's also keep in mind that most violence does not happen on the streets. The second key point for me is the fact that Sarah Everard, in a way, is a perfect victim, and it has been portrayed as a perfect victim. In a way, this can lead the discussion to a problematic ally, if you want, because of course every time there is violence against women, there is a victim blaming process where women are accused of being responsible for the violence that is perpetrated against them. However, the answer to this discourse, to this misogynist and sexist discourse, is not to say she was just walking home, she was so innocent. It's horrible that she was just walking home, but that's not the problem. What happened would have been horrible if she was walking home. It would have been horrible if she would have been sex working on the streets. It would have been horrible if she was drunk at a party, and it would have been horrible if it happened while she was resisting police arrest or committing a crime. So focusing on her innocence and on the fact that she was just walking home also can be dangerous in framing the discussions around who deserves and who doesn't deserve violence.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
I wanted to say there that I think like listening sounds like such a simple thing, doesn't it? But actually, I think it is quite powerful, especially when we think that in terms of masculinity and how we raise boys, we often don't actually, teach them to develop those kind of like interpersonal communicative skills like listening, which actually means, taking a step back and like not dominating the conversation and not going out there acting like you already have all the answers, but actually just listening, and especially to women, right? Like that's somehow seen as not a very manly thing to do, is just to sit and listen to what women are saying. So actually by doing that, well, I think basically that shows how we need to change these ideas of masculinity, and how listening can be a profound and an important thing to do. But then obviously, and then the next step is to take action based on what you've heard, but to always do so, based on the idea that you're listening to what women are saying. You're not just acting like you have all the answers, as I said. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to mention there as well is that also listening can be quite uncomfortable, right? Like we can hear about things which maybe we have ourselves, been involved in the past, or stayed silent about, or, and encountered but not done anything about it. And I think we need to kind of sit with that uncomfortability and deal with that. And, rather than reacting in a kind of defensive way, as it might be tempting to do, and as unfortunately we do see men and boys reacting in that way sometimes when they hear these things, just sit with it and think about, yes, I may be complicit in this problem, but I can change that, and I can actually be a positive force for change in the future.
Just to agree really with what Stephen and Deanna are saying here, really, there is no excuse for violence. So regardless of who the victim is, there is no excuse for it. And in this case, as Deanna was saying, we did have a white British, women being victimized on the streets. And so it is unexcusable, but we also have to remember that, there are many forms of violence that are happening in different spheres of our society. and they shouldn't be happening. And some of this violence is, also structural, is also the violence of violence of cuts, of people losing their jobs, economic violences, environmental violences that often do affect disproportionately, women, people of color, minorities, etc. So just to say, I agree, and I think it is important to listen, and it's important to draw lessons from this, and to really kind of have those dialogues that are, like Stephen said, very can be very difficult, and it can be painful. Actually, a lot of learning can be very painful, but I think it's something that we have to embrace.
Thank you. And I suppose the difficult next step is once the listening is done, once we've opened up the conversations, the next difficult step is what happens next. And I suppose that's what's being talked about on social media in quite seismic portions at the moment. So what is the next step? Where do we go from here?
Okay, I'll come in on that one. This is a difficult question, but I think, we do need a social movement. We do need collective actions. And I think there are already, some groups that are, gaining momentum and trying to organize a collective response. But these are really difficult times politically, especially when we have, situations in which our own government is trying to inhibit or intimidate or delegitimize those struggles by, policing them in repressive ways, by arresting people that are trying to, show their support for these causes. So it is really difficult when people feel, and movements and activists feel like they're being silenced, like there are being attempts at dismantling those movements. But I do think we need a kind of a political opposition to this. We need a movement, a collective response by people, so that we can begin to create little cracks in the system, to borrow something that Deanna once told me, actually, in a different discussion. We need to create those little cracks, and then eventually, they are going to hopefully cause kind of, structural changes that, we hope for. It's like living this activist life, I suppose, that, we see many feminists have been living for decades now, people like Angela Davis and so on, that, they continue to do this work, and the work of, education and trying to address those inequalities.
Yeah, Deanna, that would be a fear of mine, that they remain small cracks. The fear is that this will just be something that's in the press for the next week, and then people move on to the next topic of conversation.
Yeah, that's always a fear, that the cracks remain cracks, but we have to start from somewhere, right? And for me, it's also important to create these cracks, to think about where do we create them. And in this moment, what is absolutely important, as Roxana was saying, is that what needs to be attacked is exactly this policing crime sentencing and the court bill, or the police superpowers bill, that is being passed exactly for silencing protests, exactly for giving police more power to suppress the possibility of people to make noise, to make their voices heard, to challenge the status quo. So if there is a short-term objective that we can look towards, is really trying to oppose this bill. Also because, especially when we think about people of color, Black women, migrant women, as well as women who are victims of violence, what this bill is doing is creating more power to for the police, not only to repress protests, but also to increase their stop and search power, which we know that increasingly target more and more minority groups, women of color, therefore creating more forms of violence by the criminal justice system towards women who are often already victimized. Another issue that this bill is passing is a digital strip search powers of the police, which again allow the police to not only stop and search people, but to strip search all their digital data on their phones, which means that even if you report abuse, if you report a crime, you are then going to be asked to give up all your privacy and give up all your data in order to be able to report this crime, which of course will stop people from reporting anything.
Thank you. Stephen, could I bring you in to add on top of that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, one thing which I think is worth mentioning as well is I think we are actually in quite a kind of pivotal moment right now, right, in terms of the pandemic. Like, I feel like a lot of things which have been taken for granted for so long are being brought into question, actually. And so there is actually a lot of potential right now for quite significant social change, which hasn't been there previously. And so, thinking about my own research into to men and masculinities, actually, I think, the pandemic has thrown a lot of assumptions about gender into question, actually. We've seen, quite harmful examples of men kind of doing masculinity. If you think about political leaders like Donald Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, even Boris Johnson here in the UK, like talking about wrestling the COVID-19 to the ground like it was a mugger, things like this. Very macho ideas of leadership have often done very badly in response to the pandemic. So I think people have recognised that, and we've obviously seen actually men's violence against women getting worse in terms of things like domestic abuse, also things like sexual harassment in public as well, of course. And then if you think back as well to like the Me Too movement only a few years ago as well, really shone a spotlight on these issues and again on dominant ideas of masculinity. So I hope, but because on the flip side, of course, we have seen men get more involved in things like childcare and community support and caregiving type activities. I mean, obviously nowhere near enough because it's still women who have been, doing the vast majority of that during the pandemic. But still, I think there are potential there, openings, as was mentioned, for change in terms of men and boys and these harmful ideas about masculinity during this time. And so I suppose in relation to that, it's so disappointing, but perhaps not surprising, as was mentioned, how kind of unhelpful the government response has been so far in the wake of Sarah's death. Talking about things like sending undercover police officers into bars and clubs, or just things like this, or tougher sentences. Things like nobody's actually calling for this stuff. Right? None of the kind of feminists and others who are campaigning on these issues are calling for those kind of responses. They are calling for things like more prevention work, more support for the actual specialist services which are actually working with victim survivors, but we're not getting any of that so far from the government. So I think that's a real need there for more pressure in that regard.
Thank you. Deanna, Roxana, would you add any more to that in terms of things that need to happen to progress?
I know, I agree with Stephen, that actually, things like funding for women's centers, for community groups, that's the kind of approach that we need. It's more like social interventions. We do not need any more criminal justice interventions. We already have plenty of criminal justice spending. We already have, the government only a few days ago announced an expansion in spending, in militarization, in military, in the military budget. This is not what we need right now. What people want is, school meals for their kids, investments in women's centers and community groups. Is a completely different approach to what's on offer by the government.
Yeah, I completely agree. As I was also saying earlier, the response to violence against women is not more criminalization, is not more security, is not more prisons. These do not do anything else than reproducing the problems that cause violence against women. Instead, what we need is a broader social approach and community approach that creates safe space for women to organize and create spaces to start solidarity groups and for women to be empowered. And this starts from, as we were saying, educational spaces, community spaces, safe homes, but also affordability of homes, dignified jobs, and a lot of social aspects of of our life that cannot just be addressed by more police, more repression, more criminal law, because what this is doing is actually considering violence against women as an exceptional element that can be removed from society by putting the perpetrator in prison. But the problem is patriarchal structures around which our society is organized, and the legitimization of violence against women, the normalization of violence against women that enable men to be violent, that make them feel that it is okay to be violent, to harass and to abuse. So it's not just by taking a man and putting him in prison that we solve the problem. We need to solve the problem structurally. And if we actually just take a man and put him in prison, we address that as the only solution, and it doesn't allow us to look at the broader structural patriarchal system that we need to address.
Yeah, and that was kind of drawing me towards the final question that I wanted to ask you, actually, because you mentioned about structures. Deanna, you just mentioned about education as well. I think if you look at any discussions, it's continually argued that this is education that needs to start from a very, very young age. So in that respect, what can we do? What should be happening within the next few years to get it into the public psyche and to get it into the education system as well?
I think we do need, more emphasis on anti-racist feminist education starting very early on. So, this is obviously work that has to be done through schools, with groups. It needs to be embedded in our social arrangements, in our structure, social structures. It cannot be individual work. Of course, we as educated people, everyone that's listening to this podcast, will obviously have a duty to call out issues when we see them, and we may end up in difficult discussions with individual family members or with friends and so on. But there are structural things that can be done as well. And this goes from the books that the children are reading in schools. This goes through the activities that they're going to do, that we're going to do in our education spaces, in our universities, our colleges. In the everything that we do, I think, in the expectations that we have towards girls and boys, that why do we have certain expectations? Why do we have such limited categories of how children, young people, or women should behave in relation to particular gender codes? I think we should be more fluid, more open-minded, and allow for more open-minded views about, how people should live their lives.
I mean, I totally agree, basically. And I think I absolutely agree we need to be raising these issues from an early as age as possible, because, that's the only way we're going to be able to create change. And it's great that we do now finally have, sex and relationships education has been made mandatory in UK schools. But then there's a lot of work still to be done there, I think, in terms of making sure, that subject actually receives the time and resources and the kind of the training which staff need to be able to deliver that to a really high quality, because obviously it needs to be of a high quality to be able to actually address these issues. But I think it needs to go much broader than that as well, really. We need to look at the whole school curriculum, and what are we teaching kids in all sorts of different lessons about things like gender, as was mentioned, and how can we encourage children and young people to think more critically about these issues. And there's a lot of research as well which shows that again, like, that's important, but that's still only one part of it, because actually any organization such as a school or a university, we need like a whole institution approach, basically, which means not just teaching the kids about this stuff, but actually, making sure all the staff members are also trained on this stuff, because members of staff can also perpetrate violence and abuse, as we've seen in the university context, for example, and making sure that actually, that organization has a culture which embraces equality and inclusiveness, and it's structured in a way which isn't unequal, which obviously, again, like, you have things like massive gender pay gaps and men dominating leadership positions. And I suppose that's a key thing men can actually do as well, is to work to change our own organizations that we're part of, make the culture in our organizations and our workplaces and our schools, more inclusive and more equal. Just that's one thing, I suppose, that we can all work towards doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that when we speak about education, we are not only speaking about young children, although this is absolutely crucial, but it's also educating the people around us and educating the people we work with and adults and older people. And this education happens also through disruptive moments, what Sarah Ahmed again calls the feminist killjoy, which doesn't necessarily also have to be always a woman doing the killjoy work, but accepting and embracing those moments and not silencing women when they express discomfort and not making them feel as part of the discomfort, but listening and actually supporting these moments of rupture within sexist and oppressive spaces, listening to these voices rather than silencing those voices and amplifying these discussions, giving space for these discussions rather than pretending that the problem was caused by the people who address the problem. And this, I think, is also a major problem within academic institutions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Before we finish, could I ask you just to give out your details? I often ask people to give out their Twitter handles if you're happy to. So if people want to get in touch with you further, that they can do so.
Yeah, that's fine. People can reach me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Roxy with a Y, Cavalcanti. Wow, that might have to go as a link because it's a very long surname.
Good. I will put it in the synopsis of the podcast for people to find the link. Thank you.
My Twitter handle is @Deanna7 with the number.
Yeah, and mine is _daily_panda. I need to get a more professional Twitter handle.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today, people. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.